The knock on the door was hard and impatient, the kind that made your heart jump. It wasn't friendly, and it definitely wasn't casual. It was the sound of someone who felt entitled, someone who believed they had the right to barge in without an invitation. I stood there staring at the door like it might burst open on its own, and I already had a feeling who was on the other side. When I finally pulled it open, my suspicion was confirmed. Grace, my ex-wife, stood there in a designer outfit I was sure she couldn't afford, sunglasses perched on her head like she was ready for a photo shoot. Beside her was Daniel, the man she left me for, his smug grin already setting my teeth on edge. "Well, Michael, aren't you going to let us in?" Grace's voice was all artificial sweetness. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Did you bring a gift? I hear that's what polite guests do." Her smile slipped for just a second before she recovered. "We're not here for pleasantries, we're here for business." Daniel finally spoke up, his voice dripping with mock civility. "Your father's estate, we have some rightful claims, and we thought it best to settle this like adults." Rightful claims? I couldn't help the laugh that escaped. "Grace, you left me. You signed the divorce papers. What exactly makes you think you're entitled to anything my father left behind?" Grace stepped forward, her perfume overwhelming as she invaded my space. "Michael, let's be reasonable. Your father adored me. I was part of his life for years until you weren't," I cut in. "Let's not rewrite history just because you see dollar signs." Daniel's smirk widened. "This house is worth millions, Michael. Grace was part of your family for a long time. It's only fair she gets her share." "You're not getting a penny," I said flatly. Before I could shut the door in their faces, a calm voice spoke from behind me. "Well, this is getting interesting." Eleanor, my lawyer, stepped into view. She was cool and collected, a leather briefcase in one hand and a knowing smile on her face. "Eleanor Price," she introduced herself smoothly, "Michael's attorney, and you must be Daniel, the man who thinks he can lay claim to something that isn't his. You're even bolder than I expected." Daniel's smirk faded. Grace's confidence wavered. "Attorney?" Grace's voice cracked. "Unlike some people," I said, stepping aside to let Eleanor into the doorway, "I like to be prepared." Eleanor pulled a thick folder from her briefcase. "Perfect timing, actually. Michael and I were just reviewing the details of Mr. Harrison's will, the one that very clearly outlines who does and doesn't have any legal claim to his estate." Grace paled. Daniel puffed up his chest. "This isn't over," he threatened. "We'll see you in court if we have to." "Oh, I'm counting on it," Eleanor replied sweetly. As they retreated down the driveway, I shut the door and turned to Eleanor, who was already flipping through her notes. "Well, that was entertaining," she said, "but you'd better buckle up. This is just the beginning." The next morning, Eleanor arrived with a small leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope. "Your father left these for you," she said, her voice softer than usual. I opened the journal first. It was filled with my father's careful handwriting and his thoughts, his suspicions, and his plans. As I read, my chest tightened. "March 15th, one entry began. "Grace isn't who she pretends to be. I hoped her love for Michael was real, but I've seen the signs, the secret calls, the unexplained trips. And Daniel, I don't trust him. I fear they're after what I've built." I swallowed hard and turned the page. "April's the 2nd, and I've started documenting everything. If they come for this estate, they'll find nothing but locked doors and iron walls. Michael will be protected." When I looked up, Eleanor handed me the envelope. Inside was a letter in my father's handwriting. My dearest Michael, if you're reading this, the battle has begun. I'm sorry you have to face this, but remember, you are not alone. I've given Eleanor everything she needs to ensure the truth comes to light. Trust her. Trust yourself and know that those who seek to take what they haven't earned will not face the consequences. With love, Dad. Eleanor placed a USB drive on the table. Your father was thorough. This contains surveillance footage and financial records, evidence of their deception. My jaw tightened. Let's make sure they don't get away with this. The day of the will reading was tense. Grace and Daniel sat across from me, wearing matching expressions of overconfidence. The executor, Mr. Warren, adjusted his glasses and began. The Harrison estate is to be divided as follows: 60% to Michael Harrison and 40% to us, Grace cut in smugly. Actually, Mr. Warren continued, that 40% is contingent upon specific conditions outlined in an addendum added 3 days before Mr. Harrison's passing. Grace's smile slipped. What conditions? Then Eleanor stood. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce evidence related to the conditions of the will. Grace's attorney jumped up. Objection! This is irrelevant. The judge raised an eyebrow. Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Price. Eleanor's voice was steady and precise. The will includes a no-contest clause. Any party attempting to manipulate Mr. Richard Harrison or his estate forfeits their claim entirely. We have evidence that the defendants, Grace and Daniel Mitchell, engaged in such manipulation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor handed over a stack of documents. These include bank statements, photographs, and signed affidavits detailing the defendant's action, including proof of bribery attempts, fraudulent financial activities, and premeditated plans to contest the will before Mr. Harrison's passing. The judge's expression darkened as he reviewed the documents, but Eleanor wasn't finished. We also have video evidence of Grace and Daniel discussing their plans, including an attempt to bribe Mr. Harrison's nurse for information about his condition and the contents of his will. The video played on the courtroom screens. Grace's voice filled the room, unmistakably conniving. Once the old man's gone, we'll challenge the will. Daniel, you just have to keep pressuring him. He's sick. He'll cave eventually. Grace's face turned white. Daniel's jaw clenched. The judge's gavel banged. Do you deny this is your voice, Mrs. Mitchell? Eleanor asked. Grace hesitated, then stammered. It's taken out of context. Would you like more context? We have hours of recordings. Grace slumped in her chair. No, she muttered. I don't deny it. That single admission sealed their fate, but Eleanor still wasn't done. Your Honor, we also have evidence of financial fraud. These bank statements show Mrs. Mitchell funneled money from her joint account with Mr. Harrison into accounts under her maiden name. Mr. Daniel Mitchell was complicit in these actions. Daniel exploded. That's a lie. Eleanor slid another document across the table. These records beg to differ. The judge's expression was grim. Do the defendants have any response to these allegations? Grace's attorney stood shakily. My clients respectfully declined to comment at this time. The walls were closing in on them. Then my father played his final card. A recorded statement played on the screen, my father's last words. If you're watching this, my suspicions have been confirmed. Grace and Daniel have attempted to claim part of my estate through manipulation and deceit. But you underestimated me, you underestimated my son, and now the consequences of your actions are unavoidable. To me, his voice softened, Thomas, I leave not just my estate, but the responsibility to uphold our family's legacy. I'm proud of you." When the video ended, the room was silent. The judge's voice was firm. "The court hereby enforces the no contest clause. Grace and Daniel Mitchell are barred from receiving any inheritance." Justice had finally been served, crumbled as he threw the photos back onto the table. "This is a setup," he spat. "You're trying to trap us, no?" Eleanor said, her tone icy. "You trapped yourselves. Richard Harrison was one of the sharp men I've ever known, and he wasn't about to let anyone take advantage of him or his family." Grace's voice rose desperate. "Now, this doesn't prove anything. Richard was old sick. He probably didn't even know what he was signing." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Careful Grace claiming that Richard wasn't of sound mind is a dangerous argument. When we have evidence proving your attempts to manipulate him, you'd only incriminate yourself further. Daniel stood. Abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "We're leaving. This is a waste of time." But before he could storm out, Eleanor dropped her final bombshell. "Leaving won't change what happens next. This evidence is already with the authorities, and any attempt to challenge the will from here on out will result in criminal charges." The room went silent. Grace's hands were trembling. Nowhere carefully constructed facade in shambles. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear. His earlier bravado nowhere to be found. I leaned back in my chair, finally allowing myself a small smile. "I warned you not to come here." Grace glared at me, her voice venomous. "You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over." Eleanor stood collecting her papers with a calm efficiency that only made Grace's fury more pathetic. "Oh, it's over," she said. "You just haven't realized it yet." As Grace and Daniel slinked out of the room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. My father's plan was working perfectly. The truth was coming to lighten. Grace and Daniel's greed had led them straight into the trap they deserved. I turned to Eleanor. "What's next?" She smiled, her confidence unshaken. "Next, we let them dig their hole even deeper. The courtroom is where this really gets interesting." I nodded, ready for whatever came next my father had prepared me for. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And stay tuned. Part 2 is coming soon, and you won't want to miss it.